In Brazilian law, the maximum penalty for a criminal is 30 years in prison. But I have been imprisoned for 50 years in an invisible jail without committing any crime. These were the words of Moacir Barbosa. Before July 16, 1950, the whole of Brazil danced with him on their heads. Why? Because he was the goalkeeper of the Brazilian national football team. That day was the World Cup final. 200,000 people gathered at the Maracanazo Stadium in Rio de Janeiro. Never before in the history of the world had so many people gathered together for a single sporting event. Brazil needed only a draw on their home soil to win the World Cup. The whole country was prepared for a historic celebration. The newspapers had already printed the headline, "Brazil is the world champion." But after the referee's final whistle, a graveyard-like silence descended upon the entire stadium. Brazil had lost. That 2-1 defeat to Uruguay is known as the Maracanazo, or the Maracanazo Tragedy. As soon as the match ended, over 100 people fainted inside the stadium. At least 4 died of heart attacks. And the entire burden of that defeat fell on the shoulders of goalkeeper Barbosa.
From then on, for as long as he lived, Barbosa was an untouchable, a cursed man to his own people. People would turn their faces away when they saw him on the street. Why does a football match become a matter of life and death for a country? Why does an entire nation break down in tears when they lose a game and celebrate a win as if they have found a new reason to live? To find the answer to this question, looking only at the history of football won't be enough. You have to look at the unknown, dark, and thrilling history behind the yellow jersey. A history hiding blood, slavery, a fleeing royal family, and an incredible fight for survival. Today, let's turn some pages of history that you might never have heard before. When we think of Brazil, the giant statue of Jesus in Rio de Janeiro, the Copacabana beach, and the festival of samba dance flash before our eyes. But many of us forget that almost 60% of this country, the 5th largest in the world by area, is the Amazon rainforest. This jungle is so vast and inaccessible that even today, many indigenous tribes live deep inside it, completely unaware of the modern outside world. To them, the world is still primal. 20% of the world's total oxygen comes from this Amazon. You could say the entire Earth breathes through this jungle.
But the story of Brazil's modern map begins about 500 years ago, in the year 1500. If you look at South America, you will see that people in almost all the countries of the entire continent speak Spanish. Argentina, Chile, Colombia, all are Spanish-speaking. But only Brazilians speak Portuguese. There is a strange history behind this. The year was 1494. The 2 superpowers of the time, Spain and Portugal, made an agreement and divided the whole world into 2 parts by drawing an imaginary line. The agreement was called the Treaty of Tordesillas. Portugal got the ownership of the east side of this line, and the ownership of the west side went to Spain. In 1500, when a Portuguese sailor named Pedro Álvares Cabral arrived in this new land, he saw a vast, unknown world full of resources. And from here began one of the darkest chapters in human history. To build their empire, the Portuguese carried out a brutal massacre of the indigenous people here. Hundreds of thousands of indigenous people were killed, and their lands were confiscated. But to run such massive sugarcane plantations and mines, the Portuguese needed a huge number of laborers. When the indigenous people were no longer enough, they started bringing slaves across the Atlantic. Between 4 to 5 million people from Africa were chained, loaded onto ships like animals, and brought to Brazil. Never before in the history of the world had such a massive number of slaves been taken to any other country. Almost 10 times more slaves were brought to Brazil than to the United States. Unspeakable torture was inflicted upon them. Their lives would end in inhumane labor day after day. Many of these slaves fled and built their own independent villages deep in the jungle, which were called quilombos. But their fight was incredibly difficult.
The most surprising thing is that slavery was completely legal in Brazil until 1890. Brazil was the last country in the modern world to abolish this inhumane practice. The culture of modern Brazil, their appearance, and their blood contain a strange mixture of Portuguese, African, and indigenous roots, the foundation of which was built on extreme agony. Another bizarre event in Brazil's history occurred in 1807. The French Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte was then conquering all of Europe. When his army set out to attack Portugal, the Portuguese royal family made an unbelievable decision instead of fighting. King João VI boarded a ship with his entire family, ministers, soldiers, and servants, almost 15,000 people. They crossed the Atlantic Ocean and came straight to their colony, Brazil.
There is no other event like this in the history of the world, where the royal family of a country fled their own land and took refuge in a colony they had occupied. They declared Rio de Janeiro the new capital of the Portuguese Empire. An ordinary colony overnight became the center of a whole empire. Large European-style buildings, libraries, and theaters began to be built in the city of Rio. Several years later, after the fall of Napoleon, the king returned to Portugal. But his son, Prince Pedro, fell in love with Brazil. He refused to return to Portugal. On September 7th, 1822, standing on the banks of the Ipiranga River, he raised his sword and declared, "Independence or death." Thus, Brazil emerged as an independent empire from the hands of Portugal. Although the country became independent, the inner face of the society did not change. There was a mountain of inequality between the rich and the poor, and between black and white people. Society was then divided into two parts. One group was the European-descended elite rich class, and the other group was the extremely poor common people of African and indigenous descent. To tie this divided nation together, something was needed that was equal for both the rich and the poor. And right then, in 1894, a spherical leather object entered Brazil. A young man named Charles Miller, whose father was a British railway official working in Brazil, brought 2 footballs and a book of football rules in his luggage when he returned to Brazil after finishing his studies in England. Initially, football was purely a game for the elites. Only white, rich boys of European descent played this game. Black or poor people were not even allowed to enter any club. Even in the 1920s, black players like Arthur Friedenreich used to rub rice powder on their faces before taking the field to prove themselves white so they could play with the rich whites. But how long can you lock up a game that requires nothing but a single ball? The magic of football quickly escaped the clubs of the rich and spread to the slums, or favelas, of Brazil. When the ordinary poor people saw the rich playing this game, they started playing football in their own way, on the streets, on the beaches, and in dusty fields. To the poor, it was no longer just a British game. It had become jogo bonito, or the beautiful game. In Brazil at that time, football was the only place where there was no nepotism or discrimination. Whether your skin color was black or white, whether you had money in your pocket or not, it had no value on the field. If you had the skills, you could be a hero in everyone's eyes, even if you were poor. Football became the biggest weapon for poor people to survive and prove themselves. Behind their madness and skill for football, there is another story of survival. You must have heard of Brazil's famous samba dance and capoeira. When African slaves were locked inside compounds, they wanted to learn self-defense or martial arts to protect themselves.
But so that the guards wouldn't understand, they combined the moves of these fights with dance postures or drum beats. From a distance, it looked like they were just dancing in a circle and having fun. But in reality, they were practicing fighting to survive. Later, this rhythmic movement, the ability to bend the body in any direction, it blended into their blood. And when this flexibility came to the football field, the world witnessed a new magical football. Pele, Garrincha, Ronaldinho, or Neymar. The rhythm of the samba dance, the mark of that fight for survival, is evident in all of their playing styles. Take Pele, for instance. At the age of 17, this legend who won the World Cup for Brazil once worked polishing people's shoes. He was so poor that his first football was a ball made of a borrowed sock stuffed with newspapers and rags. From there, he became the king of football. But Brazilian football was not always just about joy. In 1964, there was a military coup in Brazil. The army seized power and a brutal dictatorship began. People's freedom of speech was snatched away, and opponents were made to disappear. The 1970 World Cup came in exactly such a suffocating political situation. Brazil's military government realized that the biggest way to keep the common people quiet was football. They used football as a political tool. The government started intervening directly in the national team. Pele no longer wanted to play international football, but under pressure from the military government, he was forced to take the field. When Brazil won the World Cup in 1970, the military government began to propagate that Brazil was the world champion today only because of their strong leadership. A corrupt and dictatorial government used the golden trophy of football as a shield to cover up their misdeeds. The situation in Brazil today is not very different either. There is a lot of corruption. There is political instability. There are gang wars in the favelas, and there is a sky-high difference between the rich and the poor. All things considered, the people of Brazil should be suffering from extreme frustration. But if you ever look at a Brazilian, you will see they are always smiling. They are dancing. They are celebrating. Do you know why? Because they have a special word in their language, saudade. There is no direct translation of this word in any other language in the world. It means feeling extreme pain and extreme happiness at the exact same time. A kind of strange emptiness, yet loving that emptiness at the same time. After 500 years of colonial rule, the chains of slavery, corruption, and political instability, Brazilians had to create this special feeling to survive. If they had not been able to create this mechanism of staying happy inside their minds, they might have been destroyed as a nation long ago. So the next time Brazil takes the field on the stage of the World Cup or Copa America, when you see millions of people in yellow jerseys dancing to the rhythm of samba in the galleries, or sobbing in the pain of defeat, remember, you are not just watching a football match of 22 people. You are watching a 500-year-old history unfold before your eyes. You are watching the story of a nation that fought to live and transformed that fight into the most beautiful game on earth.